Hello, konnichiwa. My name is Miguel Klüsner-Goth. I'm professor at the Yokohama National University. I would like to talk to you in this lecture today about boundaries, boundaries of the planet, boundaries of the natural resources, the human beings, and how all this relates together. So let's share, as usual, my screen. So, what we will talk about? We talk about planetary boundaries. What are the limits for biodiversity and conservation and sustainable use of natural resources? For this, I'm using a very interesting review done by a British researcher, Mr. Dasgupta. This was a review called On the Economics of Biodiversity, and it has been done last year, 2021. So here you see the book, the cover. It's called The Economics of Biodiversity, the Dasgupta Review, and I refer particularly to the abridged version. This has a copyright. You see it here on the left side. I really do encourage all of you to read at least the abridged version, because what I am presenting to you is a summary of it. And you know, summaries unfortunately cannot take everything on board, but I try to get in a certain message the essence of this review. So everything that I will present to you, or mostly, I mean more than 90%, comes from this review. And so there's a copyright on it. You see that? So this document is a UK official document, so it's available. But please, when you listen to me, when you see the different graphs and text, this all refers to more than 90% to this review. So let's get started. Planetary boundaries. So critical Earth system processes and their boundaries. So you see this circle with different parts of it. You see here the source where this diagram is coming. It explains climate change, ozone depletion, atmospheric aerosol loading, biochemical flows, freshwater use. And so this BII, Biodiversity Intactness Index, also E to MSY, extinctions per millions per year. And in fact, it will show you where it is known. For example, for BII, it's not yet quantified so far. Where we are. Are we below the boundary? So we are sort of in the safe part. Are we in the sort of uncertainty? If there is a risk? Or are we already outside this? Are we outside the risk? So we are, for example, let's start on the right side down, ocean acidification. We are still on the good side, but we are coming close to the border. The aerosol loading has not been quantified, so we cannot speak on that. The ozone depletion, you remember some years ago, there was a big alarm. It could be calmed down. Climate change, we definitely are in a zone of uncertainty, and we feel the effects. But then the extinction rate, we are by far over. And this is, we are deep in the red side. Land system change, we are also in a sort of uncertainty, and I will come back later to it. Freshwater use, we are still doing quite fine, although, I mean, this is a global diagram. So in some countries, it may be different. Biochemical flows like phosphor, nitrogen, we are above it. But I will come later back to it. Just to let you know what we are talking about. Boundaries. What does it mean? And always the relationship, and I will insist a lot of it on human beings, biodiversity, and economics. So I found in this review a very interesting foreword from Sir David Attenborough. And I would like to, as I quoted here, sort of read it, that we have to consider the following facts. Today, we, the human beings, together with the livestock that we are rearing for food, constitute 96% of the mass of all mammals on the planet. 4% of the rest of these mammals, from elephants to badgers, moose to monkeys, is the rest, 4%. 70% of all the birds on the planet, that live on the planet, are poultry, mostly chicken for us to eat, 70%. 30% are all the other birds that we know flying around. This means that we are destroying biodiversity that has until recently enabled us really to use this world very abundantly. And of course, there's alarm cry saying, if we continue like that, if we continue this damage, this whole Earth ecosystem may collapse. So this is the risk we are facing. This to the foreword of Sir David Attenborough in this review. So what are our assets? You see here the Sustainable Development Goals. I think I don't need to explain this anymore. So what do we have to do? Economic development, for example, should be sustainable. I refer to the SDGs that was adopted by all the UN member states in 2015. So what do we really understand by sustainable development? What is the dependence on nature for us in this? What's the role of all the vehicles that we use for transport, the homes in which we live, machines, equipment, all these production systems that we are using? But now I would like to quote again Mr. Dasgupta, saying that like education and health, nature, what the feeling is that we have on nature, is more than a real only economic good. Nature is giving us food, nourishing us. So we have to think about all the other assets and see how they have their value in this world, how they fit into that. And then we see on the extension from the economics on the biodiversity, how all these values are managed and what is the value of it and where we are situated today in that, looking into this economic part of nature. Because, you know, nature has not only positive effects of us. In all our production systems, we have a lot of harmful pests that attacks the plants, the animals that we use in forestry, in fisheries, in agriculture. What we are trying is, of course, to control these pests that, let's say, attack us. Bacteria, viruses can be good, can be bad. I mean, the last COVID-19 virus has shown that nature can also provide extremely harmful events to us. So let's speak a little bit about economic growth and this famous sustainability of economic growth. You know all about the GDP, gross domestic product, which is, of course, the economic performance of all the activities that are done in a given country that have an economic value and that have an output per year of the value that they are producing, positive and negative values. And this is already the first problem. Because if you have a production system that is positive and you quantify it, it's good. But if you have to produce as a negative system and you quantify it, normally this should be accounted negatively. But we're doing in GDP, we are counting it positively. For example, eroding natural assets has been counted positively into the economic growth. Let's give an example. You build a road. This is a construction. This costs money. This is in the GDP counted. This road, when it's used, produces a lot of noise. So people say, we don't want that noise. So we build a wall. This wall is only useful to get the noise away. But in fact, it is a consequence of the negative impact of the noise to the people. But it is counted positively in the GDP. In fact, it should be deduced from the GDP. So, Dasgupta says we need another measure than what is called GDP. We know that 60% of the world population today lives in urban environments, and maybe more in 2050. 70% are the estimates. We don't know it yet. But no, in my lifetime, I'm 65 years old. The population more than doubled. In fact, it increased by 2.77. 1957, when I was born, we were 2.87 billion people on the earth. Today, we are 7.97 billion people, almost 8. So, the Brundtland Commission defines sustainable development as a development that meets, of course, the needs of the present, what we are using, without, and then comes the term sustainable, compromising the future of future generations and what they might need. This means, of course, that we should live to the next and future generations a state of nature with the same productivity that we have inherited. So, as I said, GDP must maybe be rewarded. Maybe we should not speak about GDP, but of wealth of nations. Because this is really where the wealth, where the richness of the nation is, where we don't count any economic activity, but we count the positive activity. So concerning species, there are many papers written on the number of species that exist. In this review, this is a quote between 8 and 20 million species of organisms that have a nucleus, genetic material in the form of chromosomes. We call them eukaryote. So defined, really determined, roughly 2 million have been recognized. So remember, 8 to 20 million, we are still far away. But there are also organisms without a real cell nucleus. We call them prokaryotes, archaea, bacteria. It is unknown. It's another form of life, such as viruses. And there is, of course, the usual discussion whether they should be called living organisms or parts of life. I don't want to go into this discussion now, but just to let you know roughly what we are talking about. But when we come back to biodiversity, we speak about primary producers, mostly plants, and consumers, mostly animals. But there's also another factor in that. For example, the soil biodiversity index. So some authors call this dark matter biodiversity. Because what is soil? Soil is not rock. Soil is this mixture where we are walking on it. 50% is air and water, 45% minerals, 5% only is organic matter. Of this 5% of organic matter, only 10% is life, living organisms. But the 10% contains the greatest biodiversity in the entire biosphere. Soil organic matter contains today 80% of the terrestrial carbon. And you see this in the diagram that I put there. 25% of Earth species live only in the soil or in the litter of the soil. So there is a global soil biodiversity atlas, and so you can see where the big biodiversity in the soil is living. What's the usefulness of this? There are many publications that these organisms living in that soil is, for example, have 75% of antibacterial agents and 60% of new cancer drugs approved only between 83 and 94 had their origin from soil organisms. 60% of all new approved drugs between 1989 and 1995 came from the soil. Just to give you an importance of the soil, in this whole discussion on biodiversity, it is really needed to understand these figures. Here it's a lovely diagram that I want to show to you. It has been done by FAO last year concerning soils and SDGs. I think it really shows how healthy soils can really be a major part in achieving the SDGs. Let's start on the left side. SDG 3, 6, 13. Water, climate change, health. The flood regulation, for example, what does soils with water? Climate regulation, 13, 15, SDG 13, 15. Climate change, life on Earth. Soil regulates also the flux of energy from sky, Now, soil is, of course, the foundation for human infrastructure. So whatever we build, wherever we do something, we build it on this soil. And soil, it's not the rock below. So soil is just a very narrow, thin layer on the top surface of the Earth, I would say not more than 50 meters. Provision of construction materials comes, of course, from soil and from the rock, from the sediments below. Provision of food, fiber, fuels. There we are, full inside. Of course, fuels, fossil fuels come by far below. Habitat for organisms, the last slide I mentioned to you. Carbon sequestration. It is the biggest part of carbon on Earth is as a stock in the soil. Nutrient cycling. Plants live on light, which comes from the sun, on water, and on nutrients. These three things make the plant. The light taken by the leaves coming from the sun. The water, the nutrients come from the soil, mainly. There are also some come from the air, but mainly comes from the soil. So there is this nutrient cycling, which we feed our animals, which we eat ourselves, all the vegetables. And this is a nutrient cycling. Water purification, imagine all the water that we produce at wastewater, and not only we, all the animals also. It's recycled, decontaminated in the soil. What I mentioned already, source of pharmaceutical and genetic resources. Don't want to go into that. Cultural heritage is also related to soil, the way how it worked, the way how we use the soil. It goes in our culture, in our spirits, in our beliefs. So I think it's a very good presentation of what is soil all about. Why do I tell you all this? Because we still have to define a little bit more the capitals that we have when coming later to the conclusion. For example, here you see a diagram on human capital, produced capital, and natural capital, and the interactions between, for example, tangible materials and alignable materials. So those who you can transfer, roads, buildings, machines, and so on. All these together are called the produced capital. They are capital goods that we produce, that we have done, that we transfer to others, that has human being produced. But there's, of course, also a capital goods that's intangible and non-alignable assets. Education, attitudes, skills. They must be included because this is human capital, is, for example, what the education level of a given society. And the education level, for example, a given society like Japan is on the world ranking very high. So this must be included as a value on the society together. This human capital brings, for example, innovation, brings labor, develops things. And then, of course, we're coming back to biodiversity, the natural capital. Natural capital is, of course, tangible, alignable, but there, for example, pollinators, it's the climate, it's all the resources, plants, animals that we get from the earth. These natural resources, for example, are regulating services like water quality. When we put polluted water back to nature and nature gives us back clean water, for example, in a river, uphill, you put not too much, but you put polluted water into the river. Let's say from a fish farming. There is a lot of food and residues from the excrements from the fish. This goes into the river. The river runs down, and all of a sudden, after I just invent a figure 5 kilometers, the water is clean. What happened? The river in its ecosystem cleaned this water again. This is really a product coming from this natural capital. So I hope I made a little bit clear the interaction between these three capitals. So we must also include other natural capitals, for example, on our health, of green spaces, and of our mental health. This is quite important. Why do we like to walk in forests? Why do we have cities in parks? Of course, there are some, let's say, hard measurable outcomes. Humidity, sinking of temperature, taking dust from the air in the parks, for example. But it's also mental health. It calms us down. It brings us green, for example. The color green has been identified as being very positive to human being. This is why we like green spaces. And then, of course, we can simply not survive without nature. We are ourselves in ecosystem, in our skin, in our guts, in all our bodies. There are a lot of beings living, and that are without this we could even not live, like bacteria, viruses, fungi. All these live in our bodies, and this microbiota are, for example, important to digest the food, to protect us against other bacteria. So if we weaken this down, we get sick. And this is a real point of it. Macrobiodiversity is really linked with a wide range of health outcomes. As I already mentioned, this hedonic well-being, we go into a park, all of a sudden we feel well, we have a feeling of happiness. This in our body relieves endorphins that really make us feel happy. This makes us less mental distress. We can this sort of having recuperation of stress situations. And there were a lot of work done in the UK on green urban spaces, on greater life satisfaction. This is also why we like, for example, to take holidays frequently, hiking, walking, moving our body in natural spaces. This is a capital. This is a natural capital. So now we come to something else. The global economy in what we call the Anthropocene. You see here on the left side, the world population between 1750 and yeah, where we are right now, 2020. And now, so you see the development of the world population, but you see also that in 1950 had the GDP had a figure of around 9 trillion international dollars. But this is not just dollar money. This is purchasing price parity, what you get for a dollar. Because you cannot compare a dollar of 50 years ago to a dollar now. There was inflation, there was all sorts of things. But what can you buy with a dollar or yen or euro? So this is purchasing price parity. So this was around of $3,300 PPP. Life expectancy was around 46. These are, of course, middle figures, not absolute figure. Today, we face around life expectancy of around 73. So I would not say doubled, but almost doubled. Those days, 1950, the population living in absolute poverty means what is calculated today with $1.9 per day, where in 1950 were around 60% of the world population. Today is 10%. This is a big success. Success, this has been achieved by the working together with all the countries under the leadership of international or UN organizations to overcome this and to take out people from misery, from poverty. That doesn't mean that today everything is fantastic. But you see here, these are real figures published by the World Bank. So quite positive, but let's continue. So in 2019, global population had grown over 7.7 billion. And the GDP per capita was $16,000 in PPP. So when you call this for the global population, is $120 trillion PPP. That means that the economic activity has increased in this 70 years where we are talking about by 13 times. Again, very positive. Well done. But this has a price. Who paid the price? Guess. It's a massive deterioration of the biosphere reserve. So let's go a little bit back. And I quote here a publication of Waters and Ale in 2016 that, let's say, from the last 11,000 years, what we call the Holocene, this is where human beings started to seriously influence the biosphere. They introduced agriculture, so they changed the nitrogen phosphorus cycle, the carbon dioxide and the methane. And we find this in sediments in ice cores, so we can report that. So there was a trend of using, and that we can see that before the last 250 years, this was a very slow rise when you see the impact of the human activities on the Earth. But then, in the last 70 years, first from 1950, there was a big change, a big race in everything. So they call it now the Anthropocene. That means this is a term used. So from 1950 until today, it comes into that way. So we will see in the next slide what this Anthropocene has changed concerning the planet boundaries. You remember the planet boundaries, what I showed you at the beginning of the talk. So let's say before 1950, all this was in the green. But since then, it has broken out of this inner circle, and it has really substantially changed the world, and we are passing the global boundaries. So, unsustainable economic development. 3 graphs here, world population, and I give always the source. By the way, at the end of the speech, you will have written in very small characters, but you can of course use it and see where are all these information is coming from. So again, on world population, from 2.5 billion, from 9 trillion international dollars, PPP, to 3,300 per person. But you see the curve is going up. You see in the middle figure, global capita stocks per capita, human capital, produced capital. So the human capital, I mean, all the values that we have in our mind in development of society increased. The produced capital increased enormously, but the natural capital decreased substantially. As stated here, the value of the produced capital doubled. The human capital increased by 13%, but the natural capital declined by nearly 40%. So, and when you see the GDP as a product of human population size and global GDP per capita, it's a sort of, you can say that it converts biosphere goods and services into GDP. This makes the ecological footprint that sees our impact on nature and how this how we pay this increase of human capital and on produced capital. Biodiversity is some sort of talk on species extinction. And there's a truth. I mean, really, we don't know absolutely how many species exist on Earth. I gave you already some figures. Some 2 billion species exist, but we will see. There may be a lot of changes coming in the future. But what we know what about 1.5 million species formally described. You know, these figures vary a lot. Some say 2, some others say then 8. There are a lot of different figures. Let's say this 1.5, I think it's a very good conservative figure that you can sort of believe. This has existed in the literature. Most of these species are insects, but the description of bacteria and other prokaryotes is less than 1%. So, as I told you, scientists disagree on how many there are. Some say 2 million, some say 12 million. I think this is not important here. Important is when you see on the right side, the IUCN Red List of Extinction on the known species that we have. 40% of amphibians. Red list means threatened by extinction. 34% of conifers, I mean pine trees and so on. 33% of corals. A third on sharks and rays. On crustaceans, almost a third. Mammals, a quarter. And birds, 14%. I mean, these are hard figures, really hard figures. On the left side, there's another IUCN red list categories where you see green, how many of the bony fish, for example, are still well, but there are quite a number of critically endangered, and this depends how much we use then also these fish. On dragonflies, for example, it becomes very critical. But on the below part of the thing, you see that there are very substantial threats to many of the plants and animals that we know. It is not that we overpass the system. I mean, some species disappeared, some monkey species, rhinos, and so on disappeared. And when I say disappeared, it's disappeared forever. You cannot reconstitute. Others are critical, others are protected. But you see, we are approaching more or less critical figures here. There is this famous IPBES report. This is the International Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And just, I don't put this in a diagram, just quickly some figures that, for example, 66% of the marine environment and 75% of the land-based environment have been really altered by human actions. They say also that in areas managed by indigenous people, these figures are by far lower. 75% of freshwater resources worldwide are now really devoted only to crop and livestock production. The value of the crop production has increased by 300% since 1970. And of course, the raw timber harvest has really gone up by almost 45%, they say here. So all this extraction of natural resources has more than doubled. The land degradation, of course, has been by loss of productivity by 23%. So here's a figure of $577 billion. This is, of course, a big risk for example, the pollinators, and several 100 million people are due to that. Also live in increased risk of floods, hurricanes, because coastal habitats and their protection are altered, and this has an impact. 2015, 30% of the marine fish stocks were harvested at really unsustainable levels. I mean, why do we have so many fish farms right now? Because the live fish stock is down. 60% were maximally sustainably fished, but only 7% where you have really a level of sustainable fishing. Urban areas, I mentioned already, have doubled since 92. 92, this is just 30 years ago. Then a very worrying subject is plastic pollution. That has multiplied by 10 since 1980, so 40 years ago. 300 to 40 million tons of heavy metal, solvents, toxic sludge, and other wastes are dumped into the world waters and end up eventually in the sea. There are a lot of called dead zones in the oceans. They say here more than 245,000 square kilometers, a size bigger than the United Kingdom, can be called dead zone due to pollution. There, of course, in these IPBES reports, a lot of scenarios that include transformative change, land use changes, and the trends, and this is the important message, are all negative. We don't see really positive trends. I think this is important to see where we are right now. When I said footprint, I think footprint is the mark we leave on Earth by we humans moving on Earth. And well, I think it's a very nice presentation here of the regeneration power. Earlier, I gave you this example of the river and waste cleaning. So biosphere regeneration and the ecological footprint is what we take out. So the possibility, the rate of which the biosphere regenerates and the stock that is in the biosphere compared to human population and the human economic activity per capita. And then, of course, the efficiency with which the biosphere goods and services are converted into GDP, and to the extent to which a biosphere is transformed by our waste products, gives this equation. As long as the waters are rising, we're on the good side. If the waters are coming down, we're on the bad side. I think the waters are coming down. So we have here possibilities, let's say, to counteract, to come into impact equality, reduce the capita global consumption, very easy, lower future global population on what it is today. I think it's a basic message. We are by far too many on Earth. Increase the efficiency with which the biosphere supply, what the biosphere is bringing us, of goods and services, are produced into global output and then returned into the biosphere as waste. So this efficiency equation must be increased. For example, water. We take out water from nature. We use it. We could throw it back again as polluted, used. But before doing that, we can clean it, for example. This means this efficiency of the change. My personal point is, of course, invest in nature through conservation and restoration of degraded area and increase this stock of nature. that is on us. So, world population by region. Now let's have a look what World in Data is predicting until the year 2100. So we are right in the middle of this diagram, 1950. You remember, this is when it's really started heavily. Well, you see here that North America, South America, Europe, more or less will keep their population stable, although I see in Europe a decline in population. Asia is still increasing on this graph, from 2020 to 2040, 2050 the population, but then start a real heavy decrease. But Africa will heavily increase, triple its population, I think from 1 billion certainly to something like 3 billion or more. Oceanic population is in this text not really mattering. So this is one scenario. I think it's a quite realistic scenario. So I think what we can work on. What to do on that? When I say reduce population, of course, as an increase, it is a natural increase or a natural reduction. And I looked through the publication and to other publications, and I think I've put some good figures together here, could see how we can do that. And this concerns reproductive health, family planning, and women's empowerment, particularly in developing countries. Talking about female education as really the best way to women's empowerment, including their deliberate choice of fertility. So I think future governments should invest by far more in that. 30% of women in low-income countries that are between 15 and 24 years old are, for example, illiterate. This cannot continue like that. Family planning and reproductive health programs are really feasible, but in many of these countries, are they low on the development agenda? This is a paradoxical situation. This must change. Then access to subsidized contraceptive commodities and services, family planning and other programs really made a difference in East Asia and Latin America in the 60s and the 80s. They were promoted in the countries with high fertility rate and had really a potential to stop 30% of maternal death and nearly 10% of childhood death. I think these are concrete figures that we should use. There is a figure saying that 250 million women in developing or low-income countries have reported that they want prevention of pregnancy, but they have simply no access to modern contraception. 150 use simply no modern contraception and just rely on traditional methods that have their use, but they are not good. So this Guttmacher Institute says that 110 million pregnancies in low and middle income countries are really unintended. So if they would have access to these methods, I mean, this is not forcing, this is really free access and let the women decide. There could be unintended pregnancies brought down by 35 million per year. And this would, of course, bring down the pregnancy-related death from the women by 70,000 per year. because they are simply done under unsafe conditions, under all sorts of conditions. I don't want to go into details here, but one can avoid this. And this is called development. And this is where we have to work on. Another point, subsidies to exploit nature and public and private finance to do the contrary, to protect. Governments still today pay people to exploit nature rather than to protect it. For example, subsidies for agriculture, water, fossil fuels, fisheries, energies, fertilizers. $4 to $6 trillion per year, apparently. But the contrary, public finance for conservation, sustainable use of biodiversity floats along OECD around 68 billion per year. Trillion, billion. And finance flows towards biodiversity from private sources, private investors, from 78, let's say, to 144 billion per year. This is a 0.1% of the global GDP in 2019. These are ridiculous figures that go into these protection measures. So in a consequence, we need more protected areas, terrestrial and marine. Oceans. The ocean is the CO2 global sink, not the plants on Earth. The oceans take CO2 from the Earth. So we must protect these oceans. We must have a sort of international control. It should be not open spaces where everybody can do whatever he wants. This is, I think, a basic message. So we heard a lot about problems, ways ahead. What can we do? What will be you doing in the future when you finish your studies, when you come into the positions to take decisions, and when you have to decide? What can be done? I will give you some examples, very small examples, but when you think, you will have in your mind a lot of examples. Just 3-1. Payment of ecosystem services. Case studies I have here from Germany, Uganda, and Ethiopia. Another case from France, law enforcement and the introduction of the notion of environmental crime. Creation, sustainable management of protected areas. And I will talk briefly about the 30 by 30 challenge and the conclusion. Payment by ecosystem services. What does it mean? There is an ecosystem that provides you with a service. Let's say water. We all think it's free. It's falling from sky is free. No. Yes, it's falling from sky is free, but the service that you get by using that water is not free. Because this water has been cleaned. This water has been directed. This water that you can then freely use must get a return. And here, Germany, in the Munich area, the city of Munich and the municipality water management, SWM system, created an initiative called Ökobauern, ecology farmers, in a valley called Mankfal, where the municipality of Munich is extracting a lot of water. Munich is a big, big city, takes a lot of water. So they say, if we take your water, thank you. But you should, of course, not pollute this water because we will take it. So you will do agriculture, you will do housing, you will be living there. You have plants, you have forests. This protects the quality of our water. Fine, thank you. But what will you get back from us? We will pay you to make projects that have labels like Bioland, Biokreis, Demeter. These are very strict labels for organic farming, that no pesticides are going into this water, no excessive fertilizers, and so on. That the water quality that we take then later from the water is good. 175 farmers have been entering in this system, and they grow about 4,400 hectares It's the largest organically farmed area in Germany that produces, by the way, good food, good farmers, good income, and at the same time saves the quality of the water for city of Munich. So the city of Munich is paying back to these area where they produce the water. I think it's a good example. You could immediately, you could easily imagine an example for Japan or for other countries. In UNESCO, we had a project called EVAMAP, Economic Evaluation for Ecosystem Services in African Biosphere Reserves in Uganda and Ethiopia. It was in the Uganda's Mount Elgon National Park region, where a project where with the farmers, do they get money for ecosystem services by applying certification systems? For example, coffee farm, there is this UTZ label that helps to produce good quality of coffee, no pesticides, protecting thus the biodiversity, higher insect biodiversity, for example, but also having good yields from the coffee by using organic materials. And really, EcoTrust, for example, came also on board, and to produce this coffee under these conditions, it got the label certified. So there was not just, they didn't just buy the coffee. The coffee was, from the label, there was some flow income back. And of course, the project analyzed, does this measure the expectations of the farmers? I think the result was quite good. And the farmers really wanted to produce this sort of coffee with, at the same time, good quality production of nature, but also solid income for the farmers. I mean, they do not want to live badly because we want to have good coffee. This doesn't work. So the 3 points must be on board. In Ethiopia, the Lake Tana National Park, again, something to remove invasive species because they block the canals, they hinder that oxygen goes into the water. So to remove this needs time, work time, and work and time is money. So there were solutions to see how they could use this work to get a better return for their local products. And I think, again, the project had very good results, saying that if it's done in a way that you speak to the people, that there is a willingness to produce and to support, people will stay on board and will support your program. These 3 cases from the country. But now, a total other story, but maybe also useful in your mind when talking about this. Law enforcement for environment. You know, in Europe, pollution of environment, all sorts of environmental misdoings in the past went without any big penalties. But there is this Latin saying, nullum crimen nulla pena sine lege penali. No one may be punished by a penalty which is not provided by the law. If the offense is a felony or a misdemeanor, or by regulation, the offense is a petit offense. So, what does it mean? Law provides for felony, this means crime. Misdemeanor is a smaller misdoing. In French, is called délit. Or let's say little misdoings, contravention, called in French. And so in 2012, it started really between the parliament and the government to change the constitution and to introduce in the criminal court the way of having criminal environmental crimes emanating from environmental damage, pollution. These are the most biggest, let's say, environmental crimes, but that are not, they must be targeted to a legal body, like a human being, a person, or let's say a company, somebody that can really be purchased. So there were a lot of long different categories. What can be done? There was also the establishment of a sort of environmental police that really could detect these violations and put them into court. This will enforce the environmental protection and the sanctions against environmental crimes. And I will give you an example. In the south of France, there are some very nice fjords and coastal zones where live a lot of fish in national parks, absolutely protected. So, but some poachers, let's call them really poachers, like to hunt in these parks because they get big fish. And big fish give the restaurant a big price. So some of them were caught. And in the past, when they were caught, they said, okay, you caught this fish, you get a fine of, let's say, $500,000 because it's forbidden. You took the fish, you killed it, voila, and you sold it. And so you got, let's say, 100 euros for this fish. So you paid 10 times the price for this fish as a fine. And the thing was done. However, now, with this environmental law, this is considered as a crime. And I had personally discussion with lawyers on that said, yeah, I mean, they just took out a fish. And I told them, no, when you take out a fish of that size, this is a reproducing fish. This fish will live 10, 20 years and produce every year between 250,000 and 500 eggs that all will become fish. So you didn't kill one fish. You did kill 5 million fishes. So if this one fish is worth $50, normally you should be fined by 5 million multiplied by $50. This should be your fine, because what you did is an environmental crime. This is not an environmental little misdoing. And I think this entered in the law and is even worse for pollution. When you, in the past, when you put some pollution into some waters, people say, yeah, but I mean, nature will clear this up and you get a little fine, away with it. No, because environmental pollution, for example, can kill the whole fauna in one river or in one coast until this recovers and you can quantify it. And the quantification should be at the level of the punishment for that. I think if we act in that sense, we will make a change. So this was just one example of France. There may be other examples worldwide. I already mentioned earlier, creation and sustainable management of protected areas. What we received from our ancestors and what will we leave to our children. Can we continue like that? Business as usual? Can nature provide still what is sort of our demands on nature? Are we there? Do we have options for change? Conservation and restoration of ecosystems, we said about. And I would like, again, here introduce one tool, and UNESCO Biosphere Reserves, this tool for nature protection and sustainable development. Oops, this slide is a little blurred, but it shows really what can be done. You can have measures of success on wealth, on good buildings. You can restore, for example, on the coastal areas, natural areas. You can empower citizens to make the right choice, that they have their say whether they build houses on the beach or behind. Community-based areas should be, of course, by far increased. When you have institutions that work on a given problem, they should not only focus on the local problem, but should take into consideration the global aspects. Global financial systems that support this nature protection. The education, I mean, all what we have in the curricula must include what we learned about it. Improve the efficiency for nature, for energy production. Here is an example given on the aeolic energy production, but really improving the productivity by healthy production. Fair and sustainable production, also production of supplies change. And I would like to take the example of meat eating. There is a lot of saying one should become vegan. It's not my conviction. I'm not in favor of that. I think meat eating is important, and also eating of game or wild meat. But instead of eating more, you should eat less and better. Means it's healthy for you, good income for the farmers, and healthy for the environment. This is one of these options for change. Because we must keep in mind that conserving nature costs some money, but is by far less expensive than restoring nature. Degraded nature restoring is extremely expensive. Protected areas should play an important role, and for conserving and restoring the natural capital, but they must be well managed. 20% of these areas are really, really well managed. The others need improvement. Where is this improvement coming from? The surrounding land of the protected areas must be included. We must include more the indigenous populations, their knowledge, the local communities, and of course, always the resources for have an effective management. This means that the small money available for protected area management has to be increased. 30% of the world lands and oceans must be better managed. And the average investment here of 140 billion equivalent to 1.6 of global GDP is not enough. And as I explained already, GDP includes positive and negative parts. So we should really fix on the positive parts and see the negatives, deduce it from them. Diseases that can come from forbidden wildlife trade, that comes from fragmentation of tropical forest, are very small, but they can have a heavy impact. And I think COVID-19 was the best example for that. Avoiding nature degradation, we said already, restoration, rewilding, allowing natural regeneration. I think these are keywords that we can use to get, you remember, this balance between demand and provision. We must keep it at least at the same level. And biodiversity is not just an issue for protected areas, but inside the area and outside the area. So it's important that when you have a protected area, it's very important as a park, really strongly protected, that you need a buffer zone and a transition area. The buffer zone is the area that buffers from the other side, and the other side is the sustainably managed area, but managed. So I give you an example here in one of my recent publications about these biosphere reserves, how they can fulfill this criteria. And I think in recent lectures you heard already about this, so this is not new for you. But it's really, again, the core area, the buffer zone, and the transition area as an ideal protection and sustainable management scheme for the sustainable use of renewable resources. Because we have the Millennium Development Goals, you remember a long time ago, and we have the Sustainable Development Goals, 2030 should be achieved. So they say. So how can these sites that I already mentioned, I mentioned here UNESCO site, but maybe also other sites also help to implement the SDGs? So we see the nature part here on SDG 6, 13, 14, 15 at the ground level. We need at the societal level 1, 11, 16, 7, 3, 4, 5, 2, hunger, poverty, literacy, education, gender equality. This is societal level. Coming to the economic level, 8, 9, 10, and 12, partnerships, sustainable housing, sustainable production. Then to the upper part, this is the partnership. This goes in the pyramid when the partnership is working well. So one of my last slides will be again the 30 by 30 challenge. That 30% of the Earth's lands and oceans are protected, 10% strictly protected. So there was this global deal for nature, which at the same time mitigates the impact of climate change. It's a global target. It protects the species, the ecosystems, and the economic security from us also. So it's not just about species protection. No, it's a global deal for ecosystem. It's feasible. It's not something that is totally in the clouds and not feasible. In my point of view, it's absolutely feasible. UNESCO only has a network of 2,000 sites now, covering 6% of the terrestrial surface. It is not enough, but it's the willingness of the countries to participate. So from 6 to 30%, it's feasible because you have also other schemes that come into that. But the important thing is that all 195 countries of the world have to be on board on this high ambition coalition by 2025, and it should be promoted everywhere. I think only with the UNESCO sites, 50% of this target can be achieved, and the rest can be achieved also by other designations. And the conclusion, I would like to use a paragraph, the final paragraph on this Dasgupta review. I told you I took most of the information that I just presented from this. And I would like to quote on correct economic reasoning is entangled with our values. Biodiversity does not only have an instrumental value, it also has an instinct worth, perhaps even more moral worth. Each of these senses is enriched when we recognize that we are embedded in nature. To detach nature from economic reasoning is to imply that we consider ourselves to be external from nature. This fault is not in the economics. It lies in our way, how we have chosen to practice it. So I think it's a good conclusion to this lecture. I thank again very much Mr. Dasgupta for having published this review in 2021. I encourage you really read this. For me, this was just an overview to give it to you. References, here you have a full page of references. You will find all this in the review, so you don't need to take note now. And I think it's quite important because it's about life. It's about our future. It's about where we will be going to. And think always about that all this is related. Biodiversity, human being, nature, economics, it's all related. We are living together. We are an ecosystem. And if we see it that way, I think we can manage. So, arigatou gozaimasu for your attention. Thank you very much, and hope to see you soon again. Thank you.